Given the recent events, what conclusions do you draw about government regulation? And I'm going to name 4 things.
Okay.
Number 1, the BP oil spill in the Gulf. 2, the West Virginia mining disaster. 3, the salmonella egg problem.
I'm sorry. Jim, I didn't hear
The
that.
egg recall.
The egg recall? Okay. Okay.
Number 4, the high number of people who were allowed to get mortgages they could not afford.
The high number of people that were allowed to get mortgages?
The high number of people who were allowed to get mortgages they could not afford.
Okay. Well, I think when we look at regulation, we have tons, thousands upon thousands of pages of regulation. I'm sure that we have maybe 1,000 more pages regulating the oil industry and offshore drilling. Unintended consequences. We want to move offshore drilling 5,000 feet offshore because we don't want it to look bad in our backyard. What happens? An unforeseen, something inevitable happens, okay? And now you have to go down 5,000 feet in order to solve the problem. Every single expert agrees that if that had been in 500 foot of water, 600 foot of water, it could have been capped in a relatively short period of time. The point of the regulation is we need people who are committed to force what regulation is already in place. Regulation is nothing but an attempt to govern people's irresponsibility. And what happens now? All the oil regulation wasn't sufficient. So now we're going to write 20 other pages to say you weren't responsible. Now you have to be more responsible. It's a never-ending cycle, and we cannot legislate, and we cannot use procedures, and we cannot use this type of thing to correct every action. We want to think that we can. We want to think that we possess that. When you're talking about mining incidents, I think mining safety's come a long way. There are issues that come up that are inevitable. But it doesn't mean what has to be done. It doesn't mean there's an immediate need for more regulation. That's a scapegoat for congressmen and senators being irresponsible with the enforcement of the current legislation. There was sufficient enough legislation in place to keep Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac from failing. It was the lack of due diligence on the part of congressmen and senators to ensure that that didn't happen. Now, as for those people who got mortgages, listen, my business is intimately tied to the real estate market. We saw this coming for years. We talked to people. We talked to real estate agents. We're saying, what's going on? How is this happening? Well, you know, this is going to come to an end quick. You know, Congressman Perriello mentioned a few minutes ago that, you know, these are tough decisions. All of us have sat in our living room and thought, well, you know, wait a minute. This seems like we could have prevented that with some simple common sense steps. We don't need to write a 2,000-page bill. Listen, if we run into a problem in our accounting system in our office, I don't need to consult with a person to say, write me up a 2,000-page regulatory advice on how I can keep this problem from happening again. I'll spend more time trying to enforce regulation than I will actually ensuring safety occurs. It's something that is in part of our human nature, and we can't, through regulation, keep those types of things from happening. We need the due diligence, and we need the commitment on the part of the legislators to hold people accountable to the current legislation. And then once we get people accepting responsibility, there might be a way that we can reduce the number of pages of regulation because everyone is accepting responsibility. I mean, it's the quick answer. You know, I stubbed my toe, I'm going to sue you, or we're going to write 10 pages of legislation to show that we're concerned with what's happening. We have no intention of enforcing that legislation, but we're going to write it for you to show we're doing something.
I strongly disagree. I think this is a case where it was deregulation and taking our eye off the ball was a major problem, and I think the SEC with Wall Street is one of the greatest examples. In some cases, it was a case of removing rules that the adults in the room had known needed to be there since the Great Depression to distinguish a bank from other lending institutions, to get rid of the tricks and traps that are out there and that were able to be sold up. That if you got a AAA rated bond, you assumed that these rating agencies had some credibility in judging that. The combination in some cases of taking the rules away, and in other cases, regulators who were completely corporate captured and asleep at the wheel. And I think, you know, with all due respect, that your view of Congress simply being asleep at the switch is a little naive. It's corporate capture where these folks are writing the checks and come in and say, oh, don't worry, we're going to be able to drill here with no problem. We can do it 100% safe. Don't worry, all this mortgage-backed stuff. This wasn't driven by sort of some compassionate desire to help poor people get homes. This was driven by people who wrote the big checks saying, we can expand this market that never even existed before, chop it up into complex derivatives, put it into credit default swaps, and be trading trillions of dollars that present systemic risk in the economy so that you and I that save up a little to be able to have something in our retirement get wiped out because the market crashes because these people are gambling and speculating instead of following the rules. We want a referee on the field to make sure that things are functioning. We don't want the referee to be in the huddle calling the plays. We want the referee on the field making sure the rules are enforced. And I think that the amount of influence that has happened here has been egregious. We do need to go after the tricks and traps. We need to let people fail if they make bad decisions. But part of that is to be able to say, look, if you go out, you should have in big letters and huge font, this is how much you're going to be paying per month. Not how much you're going to pay for the first 18 months before something goes crazy afterwards, but by that point, people have sold the derivative or the mortgage up the line, so they don't have to do their due diligence. It gets back to basics, and I think you understand this, Mr. Clark, that at the local level, our community banks still make pretty good loans. I'm going to get yanked here, and so I'll come back to it later. We'll talk about community banks.